Hello, and welcome to another episode of Defence Uncut, the first dedicated English language Pakistani defense news commentary podcast, where we unpack Pakistani military procurements, events, and issues in laser focused detail so that you build an accurate and informative big picture. So, starting this week, we decided to change things up a little by splitting our episodes into two per week, with one focused specifically on a Pakistani defense news topic, and the other looking at countries and or issues that, while not Pakistani directly, relevant to Pakistan. So this week, we're going to unpack the recent reports of the Indian Air Force calling on the government of India to begin talks for an additional 114 Dassault Rafale fighters. Now, correct us if we're wrong, but this could be the IAF calling on the government to steer the forthcoming MRFA bid to sole source the Rafale and basically not bother with other platforms or fifth-gen fighter distractions like the Su-57 and F-35. We at KUA had alluded to this a few times, but basically focusing on the Rafale and Tejas today would be the most cost-efficient and technically prudent decision for the IAF. Significant investment has already been made in the way of establishing the operating overhead for both platforms, so it makes sense to leverage that across more units. In a sense, the air crews operating the Rafales and Tejas fighters today can lead future units, define training procedures, and in a sense force a focused consolidation of the IAF. Likewise, doubling down with the French buys India more leverage in Paris to deepen its relationships with Dassault, Thales, Safran Group, and others, and push them for transfer of technology, build in India initiatives, and support marquee Indian programs like the AMCA. Of course, political priorities could always get in the way of the objective technical recommendations, so it will be interesting to see what direction the IAF takes and how it can impact the Pakistan Air Force. Once again, joining me is Asim, an aerospace engineer based out of the United States. And as for myself, the founder of KUA, I'm based in Canada. So Asim, how are you?
Good.
So let's just dive in right here. So the IAF recommend to the government of India to start talks on 114 Rafale fighters. What do you think?
Honestly, I think this is a positive step, but it really depends on what the government decides. As we all know, that Tejas was a victim of, the constant haggling between the IAF and the government, right? That's essentially what, caused most of that program's problems. Now, India has, very small number of Rafales. So it doesn't make sense for them to, to stay at that number. And I'm pretty sure, when they were buying their Rafales, their goal wasn't to, have that number. They always wanted, a certain number of Rafales. Just like they have, built a significant number of Su-30 MKIs. That's basically the backbone of the Indian Air Force. And this is something that perhaps, the Indian Air Force can, learn from the PAF. And I'm not saying that the IAF does not know this. I'm like 100% sure the IAF knows this, but because the government in India constantly interferes with those decisions, it's unable to do what it wants to do. But what they should be doing is focus on a few platforms and build them in numbers and, train on them, improve them. Basically what they've done with the Su-30 MKI. That's a shining example of what to do, right? And the Tejas is a shining example of what not to do, right? So I suspect this request from the Indian Air Force to get more Rafales is more in the line of what the Su-30 MKI model is.
Yeah, it sort of speaks to, it reminds me of their Mirage 2000 program. So they specifically acquired the Mirage 2000 in the 80s as a counter to Pakistan buying the F-16s, right? And it seemed that, the initial plan was to eventually manufacture the Mirage in India in numbers to replace the bulk of their older aircraft, to have this very versatile single-engine multi-role fighter to form the mainstay of their fleet and to run most of their operations through the go-to option for everything from air to air to air to surface, anti-ship, you name it, right? The platform was fundamentally designed to do all that. And there was an opportunity to bring it home in India. And even as the French would wind down their production, you can kind of own the platform and start customizing it and obviously keep manufacturing it to your requirements. And that didn't happen. Instead, they basically added the MiG-29 into the picture. Then they added the Su-30 into the picture. At least with the Su-30, it wasn't a bad program. I think from an industrial standpoint, ironically, it was like pretty successful, relatively speaking, even compared to the Tejas. So with the IF, they've always had the right plans in the picture, but it just seems like the Indian government's priorities, and this goes back to the bigger discussion of the Indian government wanting to maintain, productive relations with every power. They'll maintain a relationship with Europe. They'll maintain a relationship with Russia. They'll maintain a relationship with the US. But they'll never quite fully commit into one and really invest themselves in that one power's core interests. And those decisions, while they probably did help India from an economic standpoint, for example, from a cultural standpoint, from a reach standpoint, they're able to access so many markets as well, including China. It does have the effect that the military decision makers get constrained with a lot of these weird considerations they have to sort of balance.
But one more thing that I wanted to talk about. So it feels like the PAF, I'll keep contrasting PF and IF because it's the natural thing to do for me. But PF has wholeheartedly embraced the concept of network-centric warfare, and it has done so for a very long time. So even though PF, has some systems from China, some systems from the US, AWACS from Sweden, lays a great deal of emphasis on, linking them all up in a very well-oiled network. And it really seems like the IAF is unable to do that. And maybe this is because of, bureaucratic reasons, or it's because, IAF is forced to buy, 5 different kinds of aircraft, and have systems on them from 10 different countries. So it becomes increasingly difficult, for IAF to gel all of this into a network. And the contemporary way to fight wars is through a network of systems. So it doesn't matter that if aircraft A is better than aircraft B. That's a very old way of thinking about things that is not valid anymore. So you can't, for example, be comparing J-10C versus Rafale or anything like that. That makes no sense and makes no difference. What matters is how the PAF fights the IAF, right? That's the real comparison. And that's based very heavily on how well networked your fighting force is. And I feel like, the IAF has struggled in this regard because, of the reasons we've already discussed. And getting these 114 Rafales and, getting large numbers of fewer platforms might be a step in that direction.
Yeah. So, and just to speak to your point on, it's not about the platform versus platform, right? It's not about Rafale versus even J-35. What we sort of explained earlier was that if the perception is that Pakistan is seeking the J-35 in order to get some generational leap over India, then that is at best a partially true perception. If you really look at just the history of the PAF, right, you'll notice that historically there's always been this glaring gap in a strike capability. And they've always wanted a strike capability. Like the day they formed the RPAF, it's always been on the wish list and it's always been denied. And the first was the British, then when the Americans came in with their aid program, again the PAF said, hey, we need fighter bombers to go and be able to fight in Central Asia or something. The Americans said no. And then in the 1970s, they tried to basically negotiate with the Americans for the A7, which was a pretty good strike platform. Again, the Americans said no because they were worried that it could become a potential nuclear delivery platform. And then platforms like the F-15, F-18 could just never be imagined. So the closest they ever got to a pretty good strike platform was the Mirage 2000-5, but they couldn't procure it because, again, the French at the time, they weren't too willing to extend any additional loans to Pakistan. They were already signed on to the submarine program. And things were looking pretty iffy in Pakistan at the time, and the French government was just reluctant to basically provide them the loan to be able to buy the Mirages at the time. So there's always been a gap. And now suddenly you have China coming in, offering to the commercial market, not just Pakistan, but just to the to arms, to militaries generally, a twin engine, low observable fighter with internal weapons bay. So this fighter would essentially have more range than anything in the PAF's platform. It would probably have a better payload. At least I remember when I recall the FC-31 fighter demonstrator. So the prototype preceding the J-35, it had like a weapons carrying capacity of like 8,000 kgs, right? Of which something like 1,000 to 2,000 could be stored within the weapons bay itself. If the J-35 carries even 75-80% of that, that is really good, right? From a capability standpoint. So for the PAF, the value of the J-35 is having this singular multi-role, low observable platform that can become a very good strike platform, especially a standoff range strike platform. And you even have entities like NESCOM sort of anticipating it in advance by developing missiles like the Rasub 250 cruise missile and the Azov 8. So both of these are modeled off of platforms like the Joint Strike Missile and the MBDA Spear, for example, basically designed to be long-range munitions that you can store internally within a weapons bay. So for the PAF, it's like the J-35 presents an option to neatly replace the F-16s in the offensive role, both the F-16s and the Mirages in that offensive strike role. So you have the one J-35, maybe supported by different UCAVs, different UAVs, and different loitering munitions to go in and provide those large scale strike maneuvers that you wanted, that you employed since Swift Retort. That's the goal. This has nothing to do with the IAF having Rafales, Su-30s, or whatever. It would have happened independently of the IAF having Rafales. It would happen if the IAF had fives. It's not more of a capability gain. And when the conversation in India shifted to, oh, Pakistan might be getting the J-35, right? We need to get the Su-57 or F-35. I think that was like an old way of looking at the situation, where it's like you buy one platform, you match it up with the other, which is not the situation. Rather, the IAF needs to think about it in terms of, okay, if the PF wants to if it wants to acquire the J-35, it's going to be for the strike role. So we need to think about how do we neutralize the strike threat. And the thing is, the IAF and the Indian Armed Forces have a lot of the ingredients for that already. It's just not being scaled up. Like for PF planners, a threat environment of 114 or 180 Rafales, if you include the ones that are on order by the Indian Navy and the ones the Indian Air Force already has, 180 Rafales plus like 400, 500 Tejas fighters is a big pain in the butt. Like it's going to require a pretty significant rethink in terms of how the PF is going to employ its strike strategy moving forward. So now it might lean even harder on the UAVs, right? It might lean even harder on the Army's ground-based rocket forces, because suddenly the air-to-air and even the surface-to-air threat is like pretty good in India. Like if you look at India's, even their SAM architecture, surface-to-air missile architecture, they use the modern baseline, right? Like if you look at the Barak series or the MR/LR SAMs programs, they're all modeled off the idea of having these compact, dual pulse rocket mortar surface-to-air missiles, which are then boosted with rocket boosters. Basically, they have thrust vectoring. They're even going and studying hit-to-kill technology, like the HQ-9C is. So this is not like a trivial combat environment. The next issue here is, like, is there a reason for the PF to be worried, right? And I think, just to sort of build off my previous point, why we shouldn't write off the Rafale. I would say that the IAF's push to consolidate on this platform would be a worrying sign for the PAF, because it indicates that the IAF understand that their training, deployment, and management issues do have some inefficiencies, and they need to rectify those. And consolidation is the right way to approach it, right? It's basically them finally sort of modeling their approach off what many Western air forces have been doing for a long time, which is to really standardize your platforms. And I think a high-low mix of the Rafale and Tejas is a pretty good combination. And then you have the Su-30s, which are being upgraded, which can provide that additional oomph in terms of, munitions carriage capability. Maybe they can model them off to what the Chinese have been doing, so transform a few of those Su-30s into electronic warfare aircraft. So what do you think, Asim, of that?
So allow me to, indulge in a conspiracy theory. So my conspiracy theory is that part of Pakistan's J-35 chatter is essentially a way to bait the IF into doing something stupid with regards to F-7 or F-5 and getting distracted. And the reason, and I know it's a conspiracy theory, so it's probably false, but the reason I say this is because getting a fifth generation fighter, an Su-57 or F-35 is getting a fifth generation fighter in response to a fifth generation fighter. Again, it's like, getting system A for system B. It's not, so India isn't responding to China when it wants to get the Su-57 or F-35, right? So it was Pakistan that announced, we're going to get J-35s. And immediately after, India was like, now we're going to buy Su-57s or a fifth generation fighter off the shelf immediately, right? So that's my little conspiracy theory that I had. And now it's probably not true, but, it's a fun little thing to think about. Now, with regards to what you said, should the PF be worried about this? Well, definitely, right? Because the Rafale is a great aircraft, and a combination of Rafale, Su-30s, and Tejas in significant numbers on which the IAF has trained well and is integrated into a defense net is no joke, right? The IAF finally, bringing the numerical advantage it has to bear onto Pakistan, right? Because up until now, India in the IAF has not been able to bring their, is not been able to take advantage of their numerical superiority over Pakistan. And Pakistan has always countered that numerical superiority by using network-centric warfare, right? Yeah, or force multipliers, as they're colloquially called, right? So this would be, if IF really does do this, this would be, I would be very worried if I was in the PF.
Agreed. And I mean, we have a question that sort of asks this, but I'm just going to like front face it. But I would say that if the IF is able to get the government to sign on to the 114 Rafales and then basically create a very clear picture for both recapitalizing the Tejas and getting it to service and ensuring it runs properly, and also fast tracking or at least, let's say, steel tracking the AMCA program, ensuring that it does, go through its milestones at the appropriate times and gets the right technical. So that's a 1, 2, 3 combination that's going to force the PAF, I would say, if they're serious, to really rethink air warfare at a very fundamental level. Like, you cannot match India fighter to fighter. So now you have to rethink what constitutes as your force multipliers and what you would need to sort of break through both the defensive net that India's about to set up and also their offensive spears, which they're about to throw at you, right? Because if you can imagine yourself using JATES with UCAS for offensive operations, then for sure the same is going to be flipped on you in terms of Rafales, Su-30s, and like down the line the AMCA program. Like, it works both ways. Definitely from the standpoint, building your own defensive net is going to be very important. I would argue that for all its limitations, it's time to manufacture more JF-17s. Let's get more numbers into the picture for at least the defensive side. If you can give new build JF-17s those gallium nitride active ESAR radars and new air-to-air missiles, maybe mix it up with both like the PL-15 style missiles with maybe the Turkish ramjet powered missiles, so you have a good kinetic mix basically, and have those in numbers. That is one option, right? And the other one would be to complement with that, and we'll have another episode on this, is to induct a new generation scalable SAM system that you can extend the range with through boosters, but make sure the core missile itself is built on modern principles, like having thrust vectoring nozzles, having modular swap out seekers and compact rocket motors. It's a lot of steps you're going to have to take now in order to count. Unfortunately, it's going to take time to implement, for the IAF to implement this program, because even if you factor in the made in India part of the equation, it takes time to industrially ramp up for this program. So those 114 Rafales are not going to come overnight. You're probably going to have 10 to 12 years before they're fully integrated into their force structure. And this is where it's like, it's like, I have like, somewhat mixed feelings about the fact that we ordered the J10, because on the one hand, it's like, it definitely helped the PAF out in the recent conflict. But on the other hand, now we have the infrastructure for this fighter at a time where the ideal thing would be to start to ramp up and pivot towards having J35s in more numbers, right, than planned. And you can only make so many trade-offs in the equation. You can only group together so many things. You'll have to make very critical trade-offs. And the thing that's going to worry me is that the PF is going to have these 20 random J10s sitting around where the fleet's not going to increase because the funding now had to get pushed towards the new generation concepts in more numbers, right? Where they're going to have to focus on, okay, we need to induct J35s in more numbers. We need to have a lot of UCAVs in the picture. We're going to have all these SAMs in the picture. So now in relation to this, and I think it sort of it's a good way to sort of leap into, why Pakistan should be worried and why we need to take certain issues way more seriously and not just bank on, as we say in Pakistani circles, like Indian incompetence or whatever, which I don't think is a thing. I think it's not incompetence in India. It's a fact is that they have so many resources and so many competing hands for those resources that they end up having to negotiate themselves into a lot of compromises. It's just a complicated situation in India with all the different special interest groups negotiating their way and creating compromise committee solutions. But in reality, Indian planners understand what needs to be done, and it seems like they're taking it seriously. So in that vein, one of the mistakes that we Pakistanis have made over and over and again, we are constantly underestimating or overlooking the Indian defense industry, right? When people ask, like, why is India able to buy 200 Su-30s, right? Why is it able to roadmap 114 Rafales? It's not just only because they have the cash, right? The thing is because they have a domestic industry, a very healthy defense industry, they're able to get the most out of the cash that they spend. People will commonly compare Tejas to JF-17. Our Indian viewers, and I would argue rightfully so, criticize that comparison because here's the thing. If you just look at the Indian Su-30 program, Su-30, the fighter that they imported from Russia, they customized with the help of Russia. Today, the Indians manufacture 80% of the airframe from scratch locally. Pakistan can manufacture over half of the JF-17, but it doesn't even source the core inputs locally for most of that manufacturing. So what we do is we have import the aluminum. We're able to basically cut and use our tooling and jigs to manufacture it into wings or whatever. The Indians are able to source 80% of the Su-30's airframe domestically. And not only that, and this is where it's going to really blow your mind, but 54% of the engine, the AL-31 series, is also manufactured indigenously within India. And then you also have the Indians sourcing their own radars, avionics, and weapon systems indigenously as well. So in other words, the Indians can build more of the flanker indigenously than Pakistan does with the JF-17. And that's going to be the same case with the Rafale. So, about 54 to 60% of the Rafale will probably be built in India locally. And again, they'll probably control the weapons integration and avionics integration stuff as well to a much deeper degree than Pakistan can currently do with the JF-17. And the point I'm trying to deliver here is, folks, like Pakistan has a relatively weak aerospace industry. Like even to the size of our country, the industrial potential that we do have, the resources that we can expend on stuff, even when you factor all those things into the equation, we haven't moved the needle that far up since the 1970s. Yes, we are very strong in MRO and rebuild, but we're nowhere where we need to be in terms of net new manufacturing, right? Because we didn't pursue the aerospace or even frankly many other industries as a national problem that needs to be solved. And this weakness will remain for as long as Pakistanis like us, we keep a weak understanding of the reality. We have to accept India is ahead industrially, and it can draw on significant advantages through its local means that allows it to scale up and really induct a lot of systems and numbers, right? And that includes things like manufacturing BrahMos missiles at scale as well, right? So in that sense, Pakistan is behind by a long margin. And this whole thing of just, we'll buy from China, we'll buy from Turkey, we'll buy from whoever. Dude, like how much are you going to buy with no money? And I don't mean this to be facetious, but really the fiscal capacity has to come from somewhere, right? We have a weird unbalanced tax net where the biggest, most robust industries and the biggest players in the economy don't pay any taxes on one hand. On the other hand, half of our budget gets eaten up by foreign debt payments or repayments rather. So all these factors will constrain our fiscal spend. And that is why we end up in a situation where we order 20 J-10s, right? Or we order 18 F-16s, Block 52s, right? As opposed to ordering 100 of each platform like India is able to, right? And this causes operational drains on the Air Force where they're going to have to deal with the overhead of inducting a new platform, training people for it. And then because the money is not there, they cannot expand the fleet as effectively as they hope to. And it's important that we understand like the gravity of India's decision. If the IF gets its way, it's going to be a pretty big problem for the PAF. Like them pivoting randomly to the Su-57 would have been a good thing, basically, because it would have been a distraction, as the team said.
Yeah. So I think you explained these things much better than I could. So you went into a lot of detail, and there is bound to be a lot of pushback from our Pakistani viewers on this because unfortunately we've grown up thinking JF-17 was made in Pakistan. JF-17 was made in Pakistan. It was, marketed that way. It was paraded with the Pakistani flag and whatnot. But, once you start digging at the details, you figure out it's more of a facade, right? And it's a facade to, keep our, people happy. But we need to, I think we're advanced enough to grow up and face the reality that Pakistan as a country has deindustrialized to a dangerous level, and it needs to industrialize, right? And that includes the defense industry.
Absolutely. And this is where the optimistic part comes in, is that we do have the opportunity to straighten the ship and accelerate our catch up. Like we're not going to say we'll catch up in 1 or 2 years, but at least we can accelerate the pace where, if we can develop at number 5 in 1 year, we can double that to number 10, then to number 20, to number 40, and be exponential in our growth. The potential is all there. The country has the capacity to produce so many engineers, right? But where are they going? Where are they getting absorbed into? Right? They're becoming freelancers, which is not a good sign, right? We have so much industrial investment already in things like the SPD organizations and state-owned manufacturing depots like Heavy Industries Textile or even PAC, but they're not being run efficiently, right? Because they're just dependent on either domestic orders, and then once those domestic orders don't come because the armed forces need something newer, they're just sitting there, right, idle, right? So there's a lot of these little factors that come into the picture that we need to have the mentality of asking the question of, okay, like, what's happening? This is where I do respect the Indians. Like, they have entities like the CAG that ask the tough questions, that put it into reports. And it is true that, competing interests will use these reports to go against their rival interests, basically. So one group that wants to, work with the Russians will use reports about, the French kind of like skimming on the defense industry offsets and technology transfer stuff to go and sort of promote the Russian stuff. And it can get annoying for those who want to do the technically right thing. But that's a level of accountability that results in good outcomes that we don't typically see within Pakistan, right? So with that, we'll go on to our reader submitted questions. So first question, how long will Pakistan take to phase out legacy aircraft and replace them with the J-10, J-35, PFX, and maybe even the Khan aircrafts? So Sim, you want to take a stab at this?
Yeah. So it really depends on PF plans. So this is just my opinion, but I don't think PFX is going to be a thing you can rely on. The same with Khan, because I don't think PF wants anything below the Block 30 Khan, and that's not going to be available for a while. So I think PF is going to build numbers with J10s, maybe J35s, and if I had to put a number on this, maybe 10 years, 15 years for all the, Mirages and the F7PGs to be phased out.
Yeah, so in the recent past, the way I theorized it was that basically, let's start with the F-16s, right? The F-16 Block 15, so the older ones that go back to the 80s, they'll be reaching the end of their manufactured stipulated life cycles around 8,000 hours or so, around the 20s. So I think one priority for the PF is to make sure they have J-35s lined up to replace the F-16s. That'll be from, the late 2020s into sometime into the late 2030s, so let's say around 15 years cycle. So they would aim for like around 90 J-35s, for example. In the lead up to that, especially through the rest of this decade, I can see the PEF doing its best to secure as many additional J-10s. Number one, to again build the minimum fleet size it typically imagines for a new fighter platform, which is around 80 to 90 units, but also because the J-10s have been a very good air-to-air platform, proven in war. That's a good advantage to have there, and you want to build the fleet you already have. One thing I would preface as well is that, obviously it would not be a fighter-to-fighter replacement. A single J-10 is just much more capable than, your F-7 or Mirage in whatever context. I'm not too sure about PFX as well. I would say that the ideal and more likely scenario would be to keep just invest in J-17, right? Just invest in that platform as it is. Build new build airframes, basically. Use the latest electronic sensor stacks, weapon stacks you can find. Through the Azerbaijan deal, you might have an opportunity to basically integrate the Turkish subsystems into them. So that could be an opportunity to basically mix it up a bit and have JS-17s that can use different munitions, different sensors and stuff to maybe add a bit of diversity into your mix as well. In my opinion, I would say that if you're focused on building numbers, it's not so much about the modern fighter. Think about how many active ESA radars and long-range air-to-air missiles can you get up in the air. If that's your criteria, then the JF-17 is good for that benchmark. So if you can build a much larger JF-17 fleet, I would prefer that because it means we're going to reinvest our money more into Pakistani manufacturing and stuff. An additional 150 JF-17 order as a catalyst to localize more of the inputs. Next question. Do you think the new Rafale deal will result in additional J-10s?
So the next question is India purchasing large numbers of Rafale fighters in coming years? We know Pakistan will get 5th generation fighter jets soon. So my question is it possible to counter 5th generation fighter jets with a huge number of Rafale jets? If not, then why India is purchasing large number of Rafale jets? So the reason I clubbed these questions into one is essentially the answer is hidden in the next question. And the answer is we should really not be, and we've said this before, we should really not be thinking in terms of comparing fighter A to fighter B. That's not how air warfare works and has not worked for a very long time. Right, so it makes no sense to ask whether the Rafale deal will result in additional J-10CEs. So PF is not looking at what the additional Rafales will you need two J-10Cs to counter one Rafale or something like that. The PF probably has a plan for J-10Cs, and it will go ahead with that plan, right? So if the economic situation permits, PF probably wants to get a significant number of J-10s, not the 20 that it has right now. With regards to the question whether Rafales can counter fifth-generation fighter aircraft, I think the distinction between, fifth-generation fighter aircraft and, other aircraft is very, it's not that meaningful, especially when you're talking about net-centric warfare. Because, for example, what difference does it make if the aircraft launching a PL-15 is a J-35 or a J-10 if it's not using its own radar? Right? It doesn't make that much difference. Maybe the only difference is perhaps the Jeep can, carry less munitions because it's carrying it internally. The only thing that I can possibly see a fifth generation, fighter making a difference in this, South Asia context is with regards to strike, because it is an aircraft that will be more survivable in a contested airspace. So I don't think, India is buying a huge number of Rafale jets to counter fifth generation possible J-30 purchased by Pakistan. It's buying those aircraft to build its squadron strength. It's built by buying those fighters to build its air force and have a significant mass of aircraft of each type and then combine them into a network. And I think that's the
Exactly. And we have earlier episodes and articles and stuff, and we basically stress that the PF strength has been to think itself as first as an organization and then as a system, and it needs to maintain that thinking. And for that, you don't want to just get into a race of platforms. You want to just think about, number one, even in the best of times, you just won't have the fiscal resources to match a bigger entity one for one. So you want to pivot and think in terms of what can you do to, on the defensive end, blunt their offensive approach, and then on your offensive end, penetrate their defenses, right? That's really the two markers. And for that, it's like things like, for example, in our previous episode, we talked about the satellite program, for example, right? That's a good example of that, because as the team noted, is that you can use your satellite, those imaging satellites, to start building high fidelity mapping. And then that you can pair with your cruise missiles, your loitering munitions, and that sort of thing, that they can start striking their targets more independently and be more independent of, or less reliant on, global navigation satellite services like GPS or Beidou. That's the approach you want to take, because then that translates into you having a larger stockpile of more high impact, high accuracy munitions, which can then potentially deprecate India's war fighting, right? So basically, it's about thinking in terms of your systems, looking for ways of getting the maximum mileage out of each dollar spent. So that's where the perspective I take is that, look, from a defensive standpoint, you want to have a dense air defense system with high quality SAMs, even though it might cost a lot more upfront. The thing is, the ROI is that those SAMs will protect your offensive capabilities, like your aircraft, your naval assets, and that kind of thing. And those cost exponentially more. So if you lose them, you're going to lose much more in the long run. So all these sort of have to be balanced in. Just the main point is, look, at the end of the day, it's like even the most optimized systems, cost efficient system, military system, is still going to cost money. There's no way we can de-link this conversation in the future from the economy. So at the same time, as Pakistani defense observers, we also need to become Pakistani economic observers and really start asking the tough questions about why the Pakistani economy is run the way it's run. Why don't we industrialize? Why don't we source more things locally? Why is there an import heavy culture? Why is it that the import heavy wholesalers and retailers don't pay enough tax? Like all these sorts of things, because this is what's going to matter when it comes to defending the country itself. Because you cannot fund a military without some sort of fiscal trade-offs, basically. So we'll conclude it there. So just a note, as I noted earlier, we are changing things up a bit by posting 2 shorter episodes per week. Again, one focus on Pakistan, the other focus on other countries and issues which could be related to Pakistan. So our next episode will air a few days after this one. So thanks once again, Asim, for joining me for this episode. I also thank our listeners for tuning in. We'll start teasing each episode with a couple of days ahead of recording. So if you'd like to send us a question, subscribe to our channel at YouTube, or group on YouTube, and we'll be sure to get your question up in our episodes in the future. So see you all again. Bye.